The unexpected guest. The sun cast a golden hue over the pristine lawns of Westbrook Manor, a sprawling estate that seemed plucked straight from a fairy tale. The grand venue was abuzz with excitement, as today was the day Amelia and Ryan would exchange vows. Their union, much anticipated by both families and friends, had been the talk of the town for months. A blend of elegance and love permeated the air, with every corner of the estate meticulously decorated in a palette of soft whites, delicate blues, and shimmering gold accents. It was the wedding of the year, perhaps even the decade. Luxury cars lined the long driveway, dropping off elegantly dressed guests in designer suits and gowns. Among the crowd, there was a palpable energy, one fueled by the promise of an extravagant celebration filled with champagne, laughter, and memories. In one of the grand rooms, Amelia, the bride, stood in front of a full-length mirror, gazing at herself. She was stunning, wrapped in a gown that shimmered with every movement. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, with soft curls cascading down her back, and her makeup highlighted her natural beauty. But despite the external perfection, there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Amelia, darling, it's time," her mother called softly from the doorway. Amelia took a deep breath, smoothing the lace on her dress. This was it, the day she had dreamed of for so long. Yet something gnawed at her, something she couldn't quite place. Meanwhile, outside the manor, away from the glamorous spectacle of the wedding, a man walked the streets alone. His name was Jacob, and his disheveled appearance instantly set him apart from the elegantly dressed guests making their way to the ceremony. His clothes were worn and tattered, his hair matted, and his face was etched with lines of hardship. For years, Jacob had lived on the streets, a ghost among the bustling city. Few people ever stopped to acknowledge him, let alone help him. Life had not been kind to Jacob, and he had long given up expecting kindness in return. But something about this particular day was different. A quiet determination flickered in his eyes as he slowly approached the gates of Westbrook Manor. As he neared the entrance, the security guards gave him a dismissive glance. Clearly, he was not a guest, but Jacob had no intention of forcing his way in. Instead, he simply stood there, watching from afar as the guests mingled, laughed, and took pictures. He knew this was a special day, but for him, it held an entirely different significance. Amelia, now ready for her walk down the aisle, adjusted her veil and smiled at her reflection. But before she could leave the room, her best friend and maid of honor, Lily, rushed in, her face flushed with urgency. "Amelia, there's something going on outside. A man. He looks homeless. He's standing near the gate," Lily whispered. A frown crossed Amelia's face. "A homeless man? Here?" she asked, confused. Lily nodded, biting her lip. "He's not causing any trouble, but I thought you should know. Should we call security?" Amelia's heart raced, and her mind flickered with a distant memory, something she had long buried. She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "No, let him be. It's okay." Lily looked at her in surprise but didn't press further. As the ceremony began, the guests gathered in the lush garden, eagerly awaiting the bride's arrival. Ryan, the groom, stood at the altar, beaming with excitement. He was every bit the charming, successful man people admired. Tall, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, he looked at Amelia like she was his entire world. This was the moment they had both been waiting for. As Amelia began her slow walk down the aisle, there was an audible gasp from the crowd. She looked radiant, like a vision of beauty and grace. But as her eyes scanned the faces of the people around her, she caught sight of Jacob standing far in the distance, just outside the gates. A chill ran down her spine. Jacob wasn't just any stranger. He was someone from her past, someone she had once crossed paths with, in a moment that had slipped into the recesses of her memory. And now, here he was, at her wedding. But why? The ceremony went on without interruption. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and cheers erupted as Amelia and Ryan were pronounced husband and wife. The reception, set inside the grand ballroom, was a lively affair. Guests toasted the newlyweds, the band played a melodic tune, and waiters in crisp white uniforms served endless rounds of champagne. Everything was perfect, except for the lingering thought in Amelia's mind. As the evening progressed, the speeches began. Friends and family took turns standing before the guests, offering heartfelt toasts and amusing anecdotes. But just as the father of the bride finished his speech, there was a sudden stir at the back of the room. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd as all eyes turned toward the entrance. Jacob had entered the ballroom. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Amelia. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The once jovial atmosphere shifted, a heavy tension replacing the carefree celebration. Guests exchanged confused and concerned glances. Who was this man? And why was he here? Without hesitation, Jacob moved toward the front of the room, toward the stage where the microphone stood. He was stopped momentarily by security, but with a calm look in his eyes. He simply said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to say something." Amelia stood frozen in her spot. She could barely breathe. Ryan, noticing her discomfort, wrapped his arm around her protectively. "Do you know this man?" he whispered, concern lacing his voice. She nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving Jacob. "Yes," she whispered back. "I do." As Jacob approached the microphone, the room fell into an uneasy silence. What could this homeless man possibly have to say? The crowd's curiosity was palpable, but beneath it, there was a collective apprehension. No one could have anticipated what would come next. Jacob cleared his throat, his voice hoarse and tired. "I know this is not how weddings usually go, but I'm not here to disrupt anything. I came here today because I owe a debt to the woman standing before you, a debt I can never repay." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She knew where this was going, but she wasn't prepared for the emotions that would come with it. "I wasn't always homeless," Jacob continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I had a life, a family. But life has a way of taking things from you when you least expect it. And one day, I lost everything." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. Amelia's heart raced. She could feel the eyes of every guest on her, but all she could focus on was Jacob. Their past, their connection. It was about to be laid bare for everyone to see. But then, in my darkest hour, something happened that I'll never forget, Jacob said, his gaze locking with Amelia's. "Someone showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it." And that someone was Amelia, a debt of kindness. The room remained utterly still, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room was focused on Jacob, but none more intensely than Amelia's. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as the weight of her past began to press heavily on her chest. The lights above cast shadows on Jacob's weary face, highlighting the lines of hardship etched deeply into his skin. His presence, so unexpected, had thrown her back in time, to a moment she thought had long been forgotten. Jacob cleared his throat, gripping the microphone with trembling hands, though not from nerves. He was tired. Life on the streets had taken a toll on him, but his determination outweighed the exhaustion. He needed to say this. He needed everyone to hear. "I don't expect anyone here to understand why I've come," Jacob began, his voice wavering slightly but growing stronger with every word. "This is a celebration, a moment of joy, and I don't want to take away from that. But what I'm about to say, it needs to be heard, because without it, I wouldn't be standing here today. Without it, I might not even be alive." A murmur spread through the crowd, but no one dared to interrupt. The guests, most of whom had never encountered someone like Jacob, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what was happening. But their discomfort only fueled Jacob's resolve. He had spent his life invisible to people like them. And today, they would see him. He turned his gaze toward Amelia, who stood motionless at the front of the room, her face pale but her eyes locked on his. Ryan, sensing his wife's tension, squeezed her hand gently. "Amelia, what is this about?" he whispered, but she couldn't respond. Her mind was too tangled in the memory that Jacob was now unearthing. Jacob's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "It was a few years ago. I had just lost my job. My wife had left me. And soon after that, I lost my home. I was wandering the streets. No food, no money, nowhere to go. I had hit rock bottom." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think I'd make it through that winter. I didn't care if I did." Amelia's heart sank. She remembered that winter. She remembered that night. "I was sitting outside a cafe," Jacob continued. "It was freezing. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, and even they were soaked from the rain. People passed me by like I wasn't even there. They always did. But then she came." A ripple of realization spread through the room as Jacob nodded toward Amelia. Gasps could be heard from several guests, but most sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Jacob and the bride. Amelia's breath hitched, and she felt Ryan's hand tighten around hers. She knew this was coming, but the weight of the moment still hit her like a freight train. She was with her friends, Jacob said softly, his voice now filled with a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. They were laughing, having a good time. They didn't see me. No one ever does. But Amelia, she stopped. The guests leaned in, captivated by the unfolding story. They were used to tales of glamour and success, not ones of hardship and redemption. Yet there was something in Jacob's voice, something raw and genuine, that commanded their attention. "She came over to me," Jacob continued, his voice cracking slightly. "And instead of pretending I didn't exist, like everyone else had, she knelt down beside me. She asked if I was okay. And I wasn't. I wasn't okay. But no one had asked me that in a long time. And then, without a word, she stood up, went into the cafe, and bought me a meal." A tear slipped down Amelia's cheek as the memory rushed back. She hadn't thought about that night in years, but now it was as clear as day. She had been out with friends, celebrating the end of a long work week. It had been a cold night, and the streets were slick with rain. As they had left the cafe, laughing and chatting, she had noticed Jacob, sitting hunched in a corner, soaked to the bone, his eyes downcast. Without thinking, she had walked over to him. It wasn't a grand gesture. She hadn't even told her friends what she was doing. She had simply bought him a meal and handed it to him with a smile. In her mind, it had been a small act of kindness, something she'd done instinctively and then moved on from. But for Jacob, it had meant the world. "She didn't just give me food," Jacob said, his voice growing stronger with emotion. "She gave me dignity. She saw me, and that was enough to keep me going, at least for a little while longer." The room was silent, except for the soft sound of sniffles. Several guests were wiping away tears, moved by the unexpected revelation. Even the staff, who had been quietly moving through the room, had stopped to listen. Jacob paused, looking down at his hands. "I don't know if Amelia remembers that night. I wouldn't blame her if she didn't. It was just one moment in her life. But for me, it changed everything." Amelia finally found her voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "I remember," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "I remember." Jacob looked up at her, a sad smile playing on his lips. "That meal didn't fix my life. It didn't magically pull me out of homelessness. But it gave me hope. And sometimes, hope is all you need." The guests, who had been so focused on the glamour and opulence of the day, were now seeing something much more powerful. They weren't just witnessing a wedding anymore. They were witnessing the ripple effects of a single act of kindness, stretching across time and changing lives in ways no one had anticipated. "But I didn't come here today just to tell you about that night," Jacob said, taking a deep breath. "I came here to tell you that what you did mattered. It mattered more than you'll ever know. Because after that night, I started trying again. I started looking for work, for ways to get back on my feet. It took a long time, and it wasn't easy. But eventually, I found my way. There was a pause, and for a moment, it seemed like Jacob was finished. But then he looked back up at the crowd, his eyes shining with something new, something hopeful. And then, a few weeks ago, something amazing happened. I got a job, a real job. I'm not homeless anymore. A collective gasp went through the room. Jacob smiled through his tears, his face lighting up for the first time since he had arrived. I'm working now. I have a roof over my head. It's not much, but it's more than I ever thought I'd have again. And I owe it to that one moment, that one act of kindness. Amelia's tears flowed freely now, her heart bursting with emotion. She had never expected that her small gesture would have such a profound impact. It was humbling and overwhelming, and she didn't know what to say. Jacob took a step back from the microphone, his voice soft but steady. I came here today to thank you, Amelia. I didn't have much to give you back then, but today, I hope my words can be enough. You changed my life, and I'll never forget it. The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, the guests began to clap. The applause grew louder and louder, until it filled the entire ballroom. But for Jacob, the only thing that mattered was the look in Amelia's eyes, the recognition, the gratitude, and the shared understanding of a moment that had bridged the gap between their two very different worlds, unraveling the threads of fate. As the applause echoed through the grand ballroom, Amelia stood frozen in place, her mind racing to keep up with the moment. The cheers that filled the air seemed distant, muffled by the flood of emotions that now consumed her. Gratitude, disbelief, humility, and something she hadn't expected, an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She had done something small, insignificant, in her mind. But to Jacob, that moment had been life-changing. Her simple act of kindness had rippled through time and space, shifting the trajectory of his life in ways she could never have imagined. The enormity of it left her breathless. Ryan, standing by her side, squeezed her hand once again, his own expression a mixture of confusion and awe. He had known Amelia for years. He knew her kind heart, her generosity, her instinct to help those in need. But this was something else entirely. It was as if her past had collided with her present in a way that neither of them could have foreseen. As Jacob stepped away from the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd once more. The guests, many of whom were still dabbing at their eyes with tissues or handkerchiefs, seemed unsure of what to do next. This wasn't the kind of moment they had expected at a wedding. Weddings were supposed to be about celebration, about love and joy, not about confronting the complexities of life and the unexpected consequences of our actions. Amelia, her voice barely above a whisper, finally spoke. Jacob. She took a step forward, her eyes locking onto his. I don't know what to say. Jacob smiled, a soft, weary smile that spoke of years of hardship and perseverance. You don't have to say anything, he replied, his voice gentle. You already did back then. You said everything with your actions. Amelia felt a lump form in her throat. She had always believed in the power of kindness, but she had never thought about how far-reaching its impact could be. She had never thought that something so small could mean so much to someone else. I didn't expect. Amelia's voice cracked, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I didn't expect you to remember. I didn't even think you would remember me. Jacob chuckled softly, a sound that was both sad and hopeful. When someone shows you kindness in a world that often overlooks you, it's not something you forget. Not ever. The words hit Amelia hard. She had always been aware of the privileges she carried, the security of her upbringing, the opportunity she had been given, the love and support that had always surrounded her. But hearing Jacob speak so candidly about being invisible, about living on the fringes of society, made her realize just how different their worlds had been. And yet, for one brief moment, their paths had crossed. For one brief moment, she had seen him, But now, standing before him, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't done enough. Yes, she had offered him a meal, but what had happened after that? Where had he gone? How many more winters had he spent on the streets, struggling to survive? She felt a wave of guilt wash over her. Was a single act of kindness really enough? Before she could continue down that spiraling path of self-doubt, Jacob spoke again, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "I know what you're thinking, Amelia. I can see it in your eyes. You're wondering if you could have done more. But don't. Please don't." Amelia blinked, startled by his insight. She hadn't expected him to understand her so well, especially not after all these years. Jacob took a step closer, his expression earnest. "What you did for me that night, it was enough. More than enough. You gave me something that money couldn't buy. You gave me hope. And hope is a powerful thing." His words hung in the air, and Amelia felt a tear slip down her cheek. She had spent so much of her life trying to help others, but she had always been focused on the big gestures, the grand actions. She had never considered that the smallest acts could sometimes make the biggest difference. Jacob's presence here today was proof of that. As the crowd watched, Ryan stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "Jacob," he began, his voice hesitant, "you've been through so much, and you've come so far. But I have to ask, how did you end up here? How did you find us?" Jacob smiled again, this time with a twinkle of mischief in his eye. "It wasn't easy, I'll tell you that. But after I got my job, I started trying to rebuild my life. Slowly, piece by piece. And one day, I happened to overhear someone talking about a wedding at Westbrook Manor. A big fancy wedding." Amelia and Ryan exchanged a glance. Their curiosity piqued. "I didn't think much of it at first," Jacob continued, "but then I heard your name, Amelia. And I thought to myself, it couldn't be the same woman, could it? But something told me I had to find out. So I took a chance. I came here, not knowing if I'd even get in. But here I am." Ryan shook his head in disbelief. "You mean, you just showed up? No invitation, no idea if you'd be welcome?" Jacob shrugged. "I figured if it was meant to be, it would happen. And, well, here we are." There was a pause as the weight of his words settled over the room. The guests, who had been so focused on the luxury and extravagance of the event, were now seeing something much more profound. A story of fate, of unexpected connections, and of the way our lives can intertwine in ways we never expect. Amelia's voice was soft, but filled with emotion. "I'm so glad you came, Jacob. I'm so glad you found us." Jacob nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "So am I." For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, the rest of the room watching with bated breath. It was as if time had stopped, and all that existed was the connection between them. A connection that had been forged years ago, in the cold and rain, and had now come full circle. But as the silence stretched on, Amelia felt a new sense of resolve build within her. She had always believed in the power of kindness, but now she understood that kindness wasn't just a one-time thing. It was something you carried with you, something that had the potential to change the world, one small act at a time. And today, in front of all these people, she knew that she wanted to do more. "Jacob," she said, her voice steady now, "I can't even begin to imagine what you've been through. But if you'll let us, Ryan and I want to help. Not just today, but going forward. We want to be there for you." Jacob blinked, clearly taken aback by her offer. "Amelia, I don't know what to say. I didn't come here asking for anything. I just wanted to thank you." "I know," Amelia replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "But sometimes fate has a funny way of bringing people together. And I think maybe we were meant to find each other again." Ryan, still processing everything that had happened, nodded in agreement. "She's right, Jacob. You're not alone anymore. We're here for you, whatever you need." Tears filled Jacob's eyes, and for the first time since he had arrived, he looked overwhelmed. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Thank you. Thank you both." Amelia stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a warm embrace. The guests, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, broke into applause once again. This time, not just for the bride and groom, but for Jacob, for the power of human connection, and for the hope that had been rekindled in all of their hearts. As Amelia pulled back, she smiled at Jacob, her eyes shining with determination. "This isn't the end of your story, Jacob. It's just the beginning." And in that moment, standing in the middle of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the people who had once been strangers, but were now witnesses to something extraordinary, Amelia knew that her life, and Jacob's, would never be the same again. The echoes of generosity. The wedding reception continued in the background, but for Amelia, Ryan, and Jacob, time seemed to stand still. Their emotional exchange had shifted the tone of the day, turning what was supposed to be a celebration of love into something much more profound. A reunion of hearts, bound not by romance, but by the enduring power of kindness. As Amelia held Jacob in her embrace, she could feel the weight of the years in his frame, the hardships he'd endured, the battles he'd fought, the loneliness he'd survived. But now, that burden wasn't his alone. She and Ryan had just offered him a lifeline, and for the first time in a long while, Jacob no longer felt adrift. When Amelia finally let go, she wiped her eyes and smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. Ryan, who had been standing quietly beside her, was still visibly moved. He placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, his touch firm but full of compassion. "I don't know your full story yet," Ryan said, his voice filled with sincerity, "but I know one thing for sure. You're family now." Jacob's lip quivered as he tried to find the words to respond. This was not what he had expected when he stepped into the luxurious Westbrook Manor. He had come here with a simple hope: to express his gratitude to the woman who had once shown him a fleeting moment of humanity. But what he had found was more than he could have imagined. He had been welcomed, embraced, and most importantly seen. "Family?" Jacob echoed, his voice cracking. He had never thought of himself as belonging to a family. Not anymore. Life on the streets had stripped him of that luxury. He had spent years living in the shadows, invisible to most. But standing here now, in this grand ballroom filled with people dressed in their finest attire, Jacob felt something he hadn't in a long time. He felt human. "Yes," Amelia replied softly, her eyes meeting his. "Family." The word lingered in the air, and for Jacob, it carried a weight far beyond its letters. Family meant more than blood. It meant connection, it meant support, and it meant love. And for so long, those things had been distant memories, things that existed only in the past. But now, as Amelia and Ryan looked at him with open hearts, Jacob dared to believe that those things could be his again. As the moment settled, a small cough broke the tension, drawing their attention. It was Amelia's father, Mr. Johnson, standing off to the side. He was a tall, imposing figure with graying hair and an air of authority. Throughout the years, he had made a name for himself as a successful businessman, and he was the reason the Johnson family had climbed the social ladder, enjoying the luxuries they now had. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat and stepped forward, his face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Amelia," he began, his voice measured, "may I have a word with you?" Amelia straightened, realizing that her father had been watching the entire exchange. She wasn't sure how he felt about what had just happened, but she could sense his unease. "Of course, Dad," she replied, glancing at Jacob apologetically. "I'll be right back," she promised him before stepping aside with her father. Ryan stayed by Jacob's side, sensing the need for support, while Amelia followed her father to a quiet corner of the ballroom. The music and laughter of the other guests seemed distant now, as her father turned to her with a concerned expression. "Amelia," Mr. Johnson said in a low voice, "I need to understand what just happened here. Who is that man?" Amelia's heart raced. She had always respected her father, but she also knew that he was a man of practicality, a man who believed in hard work and self-reliance. She wasn't sure how he would react to Jacob's story, or to the promise she and Ryan had just made. But she had no intention of hiding the truth. "His name is Jacob," she began, her voice steady. He's someone I met a long time ago. Someone I helped, without even realizing it." Mr. Johnson frowned. "Helped? How?" Amelia hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words to explain. "It was years ago, during a storm. He was homeless, and I gave him some food. I didn't think much of it at the time, but apparently that small act of kindness made a bigger impact than I ever realized." Her father's eyes narrowed. "And now he's here, at your wedding, telling everyone this story." Amelia could hear the skepticism in his voice, the way he was already trying to make sense of the situation through his own logical lens. She knew that her father had a tendency to question things that didn't fit into his neatly ordered world. "Yes, Dad," Amelia said gently. "He's here because he wanted to thank me. He wanted to share how that moment changed his life. And he's not asking for anything. He's just sharing his story." Mr. Johnson crossed his arms, his expression still doubtful. "And now you've told him that he's family." Amelia nodded, standing firm in her decision. "Yes, I did, because he's not just some random person. He's someone who's been through unimaginable hardship, and I want to help him. We want to help him." Her father sighed, his face softening just a fraction. "Amelia, I know you've always had a kind heart, but you need to be careful. Not everyone has good intentions, especially people who come from difficult circumstances." Amelia bristled slightly at her father's words. She understood his concerns. He had always been protective of her. But she also knew that this wasn't about being naive. This was about doing what was right. "I know, Dad," she said quietly, "but I trust Jacob. And more than that, I believe in the power of compassion. He's not asking for money or for charity. He's just grateful. And I think we owe it to ourselves and to him to open our hearts." Mr. Johnson studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed again, this time with more resignation than disapproval. "I just want you to be happy, Amelia. I want you to be careful, too. But if this is what you believe is right, then I'll support you." Amelia smiled, feeling a surge of relief. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot." He nodded, giving her a small smile in return. "Just keep your eyes open, all right? The world can be a tough place." Amelia knew that her father's words came from a place of love, and she appreciated his concern. But she also knew that this was one of those moments where she had to follow her own heart, no matter how uncertain the path ahead might be. As she returned to Jacob and Ryan, Amelia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The future was unknown, but she wasn't afraid. She had always believed in the goodness of people, and today she had been reminded of the impact that one small act of kindness could have. Ryan, who had been speaking quietly with Jacob, looked up as Amelia approached. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Amelia nodded. "Everything's fine," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "We're going to help Jacob, whatever it takes." Jacob, who had been standing off to the side, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to be a burden," he said, his voice quiet. "I appreciate everything you've done, but I can take care of myself. I have been for years." Amelia stepped closer, her expression warm but firm. "You're not a burden, Jacob. You're a part of our lives now. And I'm not just offering you help, I'm offering you a chance to rebuild. You've spent years surviving. Now, it's time to live." Jacob's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment he looked away, overwhelmed by the generosity being offered to him. He had spent so long on the outside looking in, that the idea of belonging, of truly being part of something, felt almost impossible to grasp. But as he looked back at Amelia and Ryan, standing side by side, their faces filled with hope and determination, Jacob felt something shift within him. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. "All right," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll try." Amelia smiled, a feeling of joy washing over her. This was the beginning of something beautiful, something that none of them had anticipated when the day began. Jacob had come into their lives unexpectedly, but now he was a part of their future. And together, they would rewrite his story, one chapter at a time. The unveiling of Jacob's journey. Days after the wedding, Amelia and Ryan found themselves back in their quiet suburban home. The celebration had passed, but the emotional ripples from Jacob's appearance were still felt deeply within them. His story had become a topic of conversation, not just between them, but also among the wedding guests, many of whom had been moved by his unexpected arrival and the heartfelt speech he gave. Yet for Amelia and Ryan, Jacob's story was not just a passing moment. It had ignited a deeper sense of responsibility and curiosity about who he truly was and what had led him to that point in his life. One afternoon, as Amelia sat by the window with a cup of tea, her thoughts turned to Jacob's circumstances. There was something more to his story, something that had remained unsaid at the wedding. She knew Jacob wasn't the type to ask for anything, but his humility and reluctance to share too much about his struggles made her wonder just how much he had endured over the years. She and Ryan had already offered to help, but she wanted to understand more about what had brought him to the streets and why he had stayed there for so long despite his obvious intelligence and strength of character. Amelia put down her cup and walked to the living room, where Ryan was sitting with his laptop. He glanced up as she approached, sensing the contemplative look on her face. "What's on your mind?" Ryan asked, setting the laptop aside. "I've been thinking about Jacob," she replied, sitting down next to him. "We know so little about what really happened to him. We heard bits and pieces at the wedding, but there's so much more to his story that I feel we haven't uncovered. I want to help him, but I feel like we need to understand his past first." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. There's a lot we don't know, but I think he's been through so much that it's hard for him to open up completely. It must be painful to relive some of those memories." Amelia sighed, her heart heavy. "I know, and I don't want to push him, but I feel like understanding his journey might help us figure out how best to support him." Ryan sat back, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe he just needs some time. We've already offered him help, and I think the fact that he accepted is a huge step. We don't have to rush him into telling us everything." Amelia agreed, but there was a persistent sense that Jacob's silence was not just about his discomfort. It was about something deeper, something that weighed heavily on his soul. She decided that when the time was right, she would approach the subject with care. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. The following weekend, Jacob visited their home for dinner. It was a warm evening, and the three of them sat on the back patio, enjoying the sunset as they ate together. Jacob, though still somewhat reserved, seemed more relaxed than he had been at the wedding. He smiled occasionally, even cracking a joke or two, but there was still a haunted look in his eyes that never fully went away. After dinner, as they sipped their tea, Amelia decided to gently broach the subject. She wanted to know more, but she didn't want to make Jacob feel pressured. "Jacob," she began softly, "I know we've only touched the surface of your story, and I completely understand if you're not ready to talk about everything, but I just want you to know that we're here for you, whatever you need." Jacob looked down at his cup, his fingers tightening slightly around the handle. For a moment, Amelia thought she had pushed too far, but then he took a deep breath and spoke. "It's not that I don't want to talk about it," Jacob said slowly. It's hard to explain how I got here, and harder to explain why I stayed." Ryan, sensing the weight of Jacob's words, leaned forward slightly. "We're listening, Jacob. You don't have to explain everything. Just share whatever you feel comfortable with." Jacob nodded, staring off into the distance for a moment before he began. "I wasn't always homeless," he said, his voice low but steady. "I had a job once. A good job, actually. I used to be a mechanic. Ran my own shop in a small town a couple hours from here. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to get by. Amelia and Ryan exchanged a glance. This was the first time Jacob had mentioned his past profession. "What happened?" Amelia asked gently. Jacob took another sip of his tea before continuing. "I lost the shop after my wife passed away. Her name was Diane. We were married for 15 years. She was everything to me. When she got sick, cancer, it all happened so fast. I didn't even have time to process it before she was gone." Amelia felt a lump form in her throat as Jacob spoke. She could hear the pain in his voice, the raw wound that had never fully healed. "I tried to keep going after she died," Jacob continued, "but I wasn't the same. I couldn't focus. My business started to suffer. Customers stopped coming. Bills started piling up. And before I knew it, I was in debt. Deep debt. I lost the shop. Lost my house. Everything." Amelia's heart ached for him. She couldn't imagine the devastation of losing not only a spouse, but also everything that had grounded him in life. "And after that?" Ryan asked quietly. Jacob shrugged, though it was clear the memory still pained him. "After that, I just drifted. I tried to find work, but it's hard when you're older and don't have much to offer besides manual labor. I took a few odd jobs here and there, but nothing steady. Eventually, I ended up on the streets." Amelia reached out and placed a hand on Jacob's arm, offering silent comfort. "I always thought I could pull myself back up," Jacob said, his voice now tinged with bitterness. "But the longer I was out there, the harder it got. People stop seeing you after a while. You become invisible. And it gets to the point where you start believing it yourself, that you don't matter, that you don't deserve anything better." Amelia's heart broke at Jacob's words. The thought of him, once a proud and hard-working man, reduced to feeling like he no longer existed, was unbearable. "But then," Jacob said, his voice softening, "you came along, Amelia. That day you gave me food. It wasn't just the meal. It was the fact that you saw me. You acknowledged me. And that meant more than I could ever explain." Amelia felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Jacob, I didn't do anything special," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I saw someone who needed help." "And that's what made it special," Jacob replied. "You didn't just walk by like everyone else. You cared." There was a long, heavy silence as Jacob's words hung in the air. The weight of his past, the losses, the struggles, the loneliness, was palpable. But beneath all that, there was also a sense of hope, because despite everything he had been through, Jacob was still standing. And now he had people who cared about him. "Jacob," Ryan said after a moment, "we want to help you rebuild, whatever it takes. You've been through hell, but you don't have to keep going through it alone." Jacob looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "I don't even know where to start." "We'll figure it out together," Amelia said softly. "You're not alone anymore. You have us." Jacob smiled, a small, tentative smile, but one filled with gratitude. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have a future. The three of them sat in silence for a while, the sun setting in the distance, casting a golden glow over the yard. The world outside seemed to fade away, and for that moment, they were just three people, connected not by blood, but by compassion, hope, and the possibility of redemption. And though Jacob's journey was far from over, this felt like the beginning of something new, something beautiful, something worth fighting for. As the evening wore on, the weight of Jacob's past began to lift, ever so slightly, replaced by the promise of tomorrow. A new beginning. Weeks passed after that heartfelt evening with Jacob, and in the time since, Amelia and Ryan had been working tirelessly to make good on their promise. Jacob, despite his reservations and years of hardship, began to open up to the couple more and more. Slowly, with their help, he began taking steps toward rebuilding his life. The process wasn't easy. Years of living on the streets had worn down his confidence, and the bureaucratic hurdles of securing basic necessities felt insurmountable at times. But with Amelia's encouragement and Ryan's practical support, Jacob started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could turn his life around. One Saturday morning, the three of them sat together in the living room, paperwork spread across the coffee table. Amelia had been researching local programs that helped people transition out of homelessness, and Ryan had managed to pull some strings with a friend who owned an auto shop. They were trying to get Jacob back into the kind of work he had once loved, mechanic work, and it seemed like things were finally starting to fall into place. Jacob looked down at the paperwork with a mix of apprehension and disbelief. "I can't thank you both enough," he said, shaking his head. "You've done so much for me. I don't even know how to repay you." Amelia reached over and squeezed his hand. "You don't need to repay us, Jacob. We're just glad you're giving yourself another chance." Ryan leaned back in his chair, a grin on his face. "You've still got the skills, Jacob. The owner of the shop says they could use someone with your experience, and it's just part-time for now, but it's a start. You'll be able to get back into the groove of things." Jacob smiled, but there was still a trace of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "It's been so long. I'm not the man I used to be." Amelia shook her head gently. "You're more than ready. You've been through so much, and you're still standing. That takes strength, Jacob. The kind of strength a lot of people don't have." Jacob glanced down at his hands, calloused and worn from years of manual labor and life on the streets. The same hands that had once built engines, repaired cars, and provided for his family. The same hands that had once held his wife's when she was at her weakest, and now, years later, those hands were being offered another chance to rebuild. "I guess I've got nothing to lose," Jacob said finally, a flicker of hope returning to his voice. Ryan clapped him on the back. "That's the spirit. One step at a time, man. You'll get there." A few weeks later, Jacob was standing in the garage of the auto shop, the scent of oil and grease filling the air. The hum of power tools and the clatter of metal were familiar sounds, and for the first time in years, Jacob felt like he belonged somewhere again. The shop was busy, with cars coming in and out for repairs, and though he was still getting used to the pace, Jacob found himself slipping back into his old rhythm. His hands moved with the same precision they always had, despite the years of neglect, and with every car he worked on, a little more of his confidence returned. The other mechanics had been welcoming, especially once they saw what Jacob could do. They were younger than him, but they respected his experience, often coming to him for advice when they hit a snag with a repair. It wasn't long before Jacob became a valued member of the team, and though he was only working part-time, he felt like he was regaining a piece of himself that he had thought was lost forever. One afternoon, as Jacob was working on an engine, the shop owner, Tom, approached him. Tom was a no-nonsense kind of guy, gruff but fair, and he'd taken a liking to Jacob almost immediately. "Jacob," Tom said, wiping his hands on a rag, "I've been meaning to talk to you." Jacob straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What's up, boss?" Tom nodded toward the car Jacob was working on. "You've been doing good work around here." "Real good. I've been thinking, how'd you feel about coming on full-time? We could use someone with your experience." Jacob blinked, caught off guard. Full-time? He hadn't even considered the possibility. Part of him had always assumed this job would just be a stepping stone, a temporary way to get back on his feet. But now, standing there with Tom's offer hanging in the air, Jacob realized that this could be something more. This could be a second chance at the life he'd lost. I don't know what to say," Jacob stammered. "I mean, I'd love to, but—" "No," but Tom interrupted. "You've earned it, Jacob. The guys respect you, and your work speaks for itself. Think it over, but I'd be happy to have you on full-time. You've got a lot left to offer, my friend." Jacob smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Tom. I'll think about it." That evening, Jacob sat on the porch of his small apartment, staring out at the fading sunset. He'd been living there for a couple of weeks now, thanks to Amelia and Ryan helping him navigate the process of getting into a transitional housing program. It wasn't much, a modest one-bedroom with basic furnishings, but it was a roof over his head, and it was his. As he sat there, thinking about Tom's offer, Jacob felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't just the job, or the apartment, or even the fact that he was no longer homeless. It was the realization that, after everything he had been through, he was still capable of rebuilding. He was still capable of living a life of purpose, of contributing something meaningful to the world. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk pulled him out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see Amelia and Ryan approaching. They had come to check on him, as they often did, bringing groceries or just stopping by to chat. "Hey, Jacob," Ryan called out as they approached. "How's it going?" Jacob smiled and stood to greet them. "Good, good. Actually, I got some news." Amelia's eyes lit up. "Oh, what's going on?" Jacob told them about Tom's offer, and as he spoke, he saw the pride and joy in their faces. They had been with him every step of the way, and now they were witnessing the beginning of his new chapter. "That's amazing, Jacob," Amelia exclaimed, pulling him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "You deserve this, man. You've worked hard for it." Jacob felt a lump in his throat, but this time it wasn't from sadness or regret. It was from gratitude. He had lost so much over the years, but now, thanks to the kindness of two strangers who had become his family, he had gained something far more valuable. Months passed, and Jacob's life continued to improve. He took the full-time position at the auto shop, and before long, he was earning enough to move out of the transitional housing program and into a place of his own. It was still modest, but it was a home, a place where he could rest his head at night and feel safe. But beyond the material gains, Jacob had found something even more precious, a sense of purpose, a renewed belief in himself, and the knowledge that he was not alone in this world. Amelia and Ryan remained by his side, their friendship a constant source of strength and encouragement. And as the years went by, Jacob often reflected on the day of Amelia and Ryan's wedding, the day he had taken the microphone and shared his story. He had no way of knowing, at the time, that his decision to speak up would change his life in such profound ways. But as he looked back, he realized that it wasn't just his story that had been transformed. It was his future. For Jacob, the journey from the streets to stability had been long and painful, but in the end, it was a journey of redemption, resilience, and the enduring power of human kindness. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he would never walk it alone again.